evening to you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to another edition of Beverly's Times Past. My name is Ed Joseph, and tonight we're coming to you from the Cabot House, downtown Beverly. And my guests for this evening are Mr. Richard Symmes and Mr. Gary Thomas. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
And Richard, this is Wednesday night, and I can hear the fellows down there going at it. We're talking about the Walker Transportation Collection, ladies and gentlemen, which is housed down in the cellar here at the John Cabot House. And Wednesday night is the night that the men all get together, and they have a pretty good time down in the basement, Richard.
Yeah, it's a workshop session, and we handle all the things that come in, requests for research and that sort of thing, and have about 3 hours every Wednesday night down there.
And then you're off to Friendly's for ice cream, I understand.
You got it.
Well, tonight we're going to talk about a portion of the Walker Transportation Collection. Namely, the subject will be diners. I like to refer to them as the working man's restaurants of years ago. And we have an expert here in that field tonight, Richard, Mr. Gary Thomas. Good evening, Gary, to you.
Good evening, Ed.
And let's start off by getting a little bit of your background, shall we? Where you're from and...
Lifelong Beverly resident, born here. I've always worked in Beverly and graduated all through Beverly schools, North Beverly Elementary, Memorial, and the high school. My mother was a Beverly resident, being one of the Whitaker clan up in North Beverly, which is pretty much where I've lived most of my life.
But you were telling me that is the family for whom the Hall-Whitaker Bridge may be named?
Yes, that was her uncle Percy, I believe.
World War I veteran.
That's right.
Okay.
And I guess they're going to be doing some work on that bridge soon.
They surely are. Now tell us how you became interested in the subject of diners. Now I know you've been a long-time contributor here at the Historical Society, Richard, is that not true?
That's correct.
Yeah. For years and years he's been supplying you with pictures and all kinds of goodies. But you suddenly branched out into diners, and you've got quite a collection, we might say.
Well, it's constantly growing. As I've said to Richard before, sometimes the hunt is more fun than having it.
That's right.
But basically it started out, I've always enjoyed doing research on old houses and actually trying to collect photographs for another version of the North Beverly book. And a friend of mine had this interest in diners before I did, and I was sort of helping her out with researching some of the local ones. And my association with her ended, and I kept on with the diners.
Did I hear him say another version of the North Beverly Remembered book?
You know, he'll be sorry because once you get into those things, there's no end to it. Yeah.
Richard Symmes is the author of the wonderful book entitled North Beverly Remembered, and it's down here at the Society. It can be had for
$20.
$20.
Still have plenty of them.
And a bargain at that.
Yeah.
Well, okay, Gary, now let's talk about the origins, shall we, of the diner, where it all started and how it came about. I understand there were lunch wagons before the diner per se came into being.
Yeah, and before you could even go inside to eat at a lunch wagon, it basically boils down to one man in Providence, Rhode Island, named Walter Scott, and he was a pressman for the Providence Journal. And what he used to do between printings was go around to his newspaper and other newspapers or night workers with a basket of food, later a little cart, and sell sandwiches and refreshments. And eventually he saw more money in that than he did working for the newspaper. So he outfitted an old freight wagon and set it up at night right in front of the Providence Journal in Providence. And an industry was born.
What period of time are we talking about, roughly?
This was 1872 that he officially started doing it full time. He had been doing it for years before that in a smaller part-time capacity.
Right.
And after that, he was noticed soon after that by different people in the area, and there were copycats almost instantly.
I have here in my notes that you gave us that the thing really got going between the years 1888, 1890, in through there.
Right.
The concept of this lunch wagon really took hold.
Yeah. Well, one man, Rule Jones, who was a policeman in Providence, he caught on to this idea right away. He saw more money in that as opposed to being a cop. And before long, he had a string of 7 wagons similar to Walter Scott's. And eventually his cousin, Sam Jones, saw this idea, and he went to Worcester with it. And there it really blossomed into an industry, manufacturing these lunch carts.
Just a minute, we'll find out when the first ones appeared here in the Beverly area, but I wanted to ask you, speaking of the diner itself, what type of structure were we talking about with the first earliest diner now, that, as opposed to the lunch wagon, which of course was a wagon which would be have been pulled by horse and team?
Yeah, well, like I said, these earliest versions were really converted wagons that had another purpose first. And you actually didn't walk inside them. It was basically only room for the man to serve the food out a window, or, you know, to actually, sometimes he would stand outside too.
Right.
And the man that I mentioned, Sam Jones, was credited with inventing the first wagon where people actually went in to eat inside. And that probably wasn't until 1887 or so.
Yeah. So that's the type of diner that we're familiar with today, the diner where you would go in, sit down at a stool, have your dinner, perhaps over at a booth on the side, perhaps, if
well, these were
possible.
Yeah, these were very small. There was seating for probably 10 people, if that. And they were only 10 feet long and probably 6 feet high and wide.
Yeah. Now, these were not railroad cars per se.
Oh, no.
The earliest diners, but people, I tend to associate a diner with an old abandoned railroad car, and I'm sure other folks may also have that same impression.
Yeah, there were some done that way.
Trolley cars especially, there were a few of those.
Sure.
But they were pretty much built as diners, not abandoned railroad cars or trolleys for the most part.
I see.
One aspect that they tried to incorporate into it later, much later in the 20s and so forth, was that railroad look, because of the reputation of the railroad dining cars for their high quality.
I see. Now, when they became as we know them today, or like as we know them today, how much would it have cost to put one of these things up, to construct?
Which period exactly?
Well, I'm talking about the earliest diner of the type that we would be familiar with today.
The more stationary.
Yeah, right.
It varied throughout the years, and there were always degrees of quality that you could get. There were different grades. Around 1915, 20, you could outfit yourself with one of these for $2,500.
Because that was a lot of money.
Pretty good piece of change in those days.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And it would gradually rise through the years. You know, I mean, nowadays there'll be $1 million is not uncommon.
Yeah. What types of food would they have served in those early days, Gary?
The earliest foods were pretty simple. Hot dogs, beans. Walter Scott is credited with inventing the chewed sandwich.
The chewed sandwich?
Which was scraps of meat, chicken, ham, what have you, and you'd join it with butter and or mustard and serve that as a sandwich, just scraps from the cutting board.
I see.
But the most expensive thing on the menu in those days was probably a plate of sliced chicken for around $0.25 or 30 cents. And a lot of them, too, were known to sell alcohol, sometimes illegally.
Now, were these diners located primarily where the factory workers would have easy access to them, or people that, blue-collar workers, the earliest diners?
Yeah, that was among the most common, desirable area, I'd say, is factory workers. But you see them around depots, railroad depots, docks, theaters, wherever you'd get a stream of people. You could pretty much count on seeing someone trying to set one up in those areas.
So the early diners then were truly for the blue-collar worker, as opposed to the, shall we say, the more affluent family who would be going out to eat, let's say at a...
Yeah, they weren't really a family thing. And I think in those days, too, family dining out wasn't really as common as it is today.
Couldn't afford it.
Right.
People scratched for a living.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Richard, I've always been fascinated by how they managed to preserve their food or store their food. Today, of course, they have the refrigeration, but back in those early diner days, would you have thought there'd have been a problem with the food going to waste? And,
Well, I suppose they had ice boxes, just as people had in their houses,
you know,
where you kept the thing stocked with ice and it was as cold as a refrigerator.
you know.
And too, they tended to buy even up until the 30s, they'd buy their goods on a daily basis. They never tried to keep much stored.
Fresh produce at the market
Right.
in the morning, and from a day-to-day basis, in other words, they would not try and buy weeks in advance to prepare foods that may in fact not
Right. And most of what they were serving too was prepared food.
I see. Well, okay, so we're talking about the turn of last century, really, as this century came to be, that the diner, in fact, came into fruition. When did they first appear around here, Gary, the North Shore area?
Well, the first references I've seen would probably have been a man named Benjamin Barker over in Salem around 1890. And he used to be set up right at the corner of Washington and Essex Streets. And then there was another man in Havel around the same time, named William McKay. And both of them, and I find this to be true of anyone who was first in any given area, was that they usually had a Worcester connection. They went there for some other purpose and came away from Worcester with this idea to start this up in their hometown.
So we're really talking a New England origin here.
Oh, certainly, yes.
If one were to, let's say it would be 1900, 1910, if one were to go out west, that idea of a diner, would that have been flourishing at that point in time or coming into being?
There were scattered instances where they did go out to those distances. I know Thomas Buckley's first wagon did end up in Colorado.
Wow.
But that was not common outside of New England at that time.
Okay. I have here a name, Charles Palmer, manufacturer. Say a word about him?
Yeah, he was actually a wagon or a carriage maker in Amesbury, here in Massachusetts. And I'm not sure how he ended up getting into the wagon business in Worcester, but he did set up there 1888, I believe, or 9. He bought out the interests of Sam Jones that I mentioned before.
Right.
And he was the first one to patent the idea of the lunch wagon. And he was in business till about 1900, when a terrible fire wiped out his whole factory and stock, which was uninsured.
Sure.
And I guess from what research I've done, he did appear back at Amesbury building carriages for passengers again after that.
Yeah. Was there any type of opposition to having these probably at sometimes unsightly little affairs sitting out in front of people's businesses and so forth? Was this a problem back in the early days, Gary?
Yeah, because they did get pretty ratty looking after a while because they were only made of wood.
Yeah. And I'm sure they might have attracted a few insects or bugs or what have you.
Rodents.
That would follow the line.
And another thing that people started to get kind of upset about them was that they were overstaying their bounds. They were only supposed to be on the streets for a very limited amount of hours at night. And they kept stretching it further into the day. And eventually they learned that if they set up their wagon on an empty lot, that those restrictions were removed. And being on wheels too, it was not a taxable structure.
And they threw up a little siding around the building to make it look like it had been there forever.
Yeah, like some sort of faux
skirting, like.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Anything else, Richard, before we get down to the specifics here in this area?
Well, not really. I think that, the fact that these started out almost like today's hot dog vendors that drive around in trucks, it's almost like it's come full circle, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah. Dog carts is a familiar name for the lunch wagon.
Yeah.
Well, okay, Gary. Now, according to your well-prepared set of notes here, the first lunch wagon per se appears here in Beverly at around the year of 1897, 1898. 116 Rantoul Street, Gary.
Yeah, and I don't know much about this fella, Calvin Holbrook. He was only in business here in Beverly for a few years. And he had been set up at the corner of Cabot and Washington at one time too. But he just disappeared from the directories in 1898 to parts unknown.
Okay.
A lot of these earlier people, there isn't a lot of information on them. They were sort of transient.
Right. We'll read the list off rather quickly here. The next one you have down here is noted at 151 Rantoul Street, about the year of 1899 to 1901.
That's the site of the present post office, and which I thought was kind of interesting.
Which was built about the year of 1912 or 13, I believe, erected down there.
Right, and it just showed up as an empty lot in the city records for years before that, and would have been a pretty good location right across from the railroad depot, and there were a number of factories in the area at the time.
Surely, shoe factories are flourishing on Rantoul Street. I'm sure there
And
was
Park Street, too.
more than enough business down there.
I'm surprised there weren't more.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the next one also is listed as on Rantoul Street, further down, 190 Rantoul Street,
Yeah.
1905.
And I'm not, like I said, these early ones, I don't know a lot about them. A photograph is even rarer.
We do have some photographs, which we will get into for specific areas for the later on diners, but for these, we're showing generic types of photographs, Gary.
That's right.
To give the flavor of what they would have looked
Right.
like. Washington Street, corner of Cabot, did we mention that already?
Yeah, that was the Calvin Holbrook.
Okay. Now, we get down to 1 Cabot Street, down at the old Beverly-Salem Bridge, right at the beginning on the Beverly side.
Yeah, that one, too, I've never seen a photograph of it, but it must have been one of the very early ones, being listed as early as 1910. It would have been right at the foot of the bridge. I think there was a gas station there at one time.
Until fairly recent years, yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And, of course, now with the new bridge there, you would hardly know the location at all.
Right.
But that was removed in the early 30s.
Right. Richard, you might want to read just a few of the names of the people who were the proprietors of this establishment.
Beginning in 1910, we have a John F. Wood, and then it goes on up until 1922, and we have an Albert Rust, R-U-E-S-T, and then 1923, Arthur T. Crampsey, and 1924-25, David Bouchard, 1926, John Hayes, 1927, Lawrence O.C. Daly, and 1928, Tully DeGenova, 1930, Fred H. Roberts, 1933, Frank Shepard, and it goes out to 1934, and then there's no further mention of that location. So it's gone through quite a few folks.
Right. Now, this would sit today just perhaps on the up-ramp of the new Beverly-Salem Bridge. Would you not say that would be about
Sure,
where this diner
just
sat?
about.
Where we begin to go up?
They've cut that corner off.
Yeah, and I can recall a gas station. I don't know, it was a Barrett station or
It was
what
one of those bargain gasolines, yeah.
used to
I think
be
it
there
was
in
a
the
Barrett.
1950s.
Yeah. And another interesting thing, too, is usually when I see that many names over a span of, 20 years, that's an indication that it wasn't a very good location, or not one of them was a very good businessman.
Yeah, surely. Well, now we're going to go across the street, more or less, to number 4 Cabot Street. This was eventually to become the Colonial Diner, which we're more than familiar with.
Oh, I think most people are very familiar with that. That was run by a man named Charlie LeClaire, and I believe it was his brother-in-law, Ralph Cloutier. he was a partner for many years, and I guess they parted ways in the early 1950s. And I've heard a lot of great stories about this diner, but I'm not sure how much of it is actually true, because I've heard that, you know, Charlie liked to tell a tall tale. But I had been told that he had been a chauffeur for a local wealthy person, and when the man died, he was given choice of his business to be set up in the man's will. And he chose a diner.
I see.
I don't know how much truth there is to it, but that's what I've been told. Another rumor was that JFK had dropped by there during a campaign stop for the presidential nomination, and everyone was impressed by how he ordered his hash with a dropped egg on top. And
I think we have a picture of this fellow, do we not?
No, we don't.
Standing over his fryer later. Was that the picture, Richard, that you took out of the Beverly Times?
That would have been Ralph Cloutier.
Yeah, that was the other fellow.
Yeah. And so this eventually evolved into the name, the Colonial Diner.
Right.
Where it stood until when, Gary? How long was it there?
That was there till what, 1980 or 1979, and it suffered a fire at that time.
That's
and,
right down next to where Rowan's fish store is that correct?
I think it was on the very same spot where the present Rowan store
back
is.
right up to the railroad tracks, just before the tracks go over Congress Street crossing.
Right.
Were there two buildings that sat there side by side, Gary?
I believe that Rowan's had a fish store right next to the diner for a while.
I think you're right.
But I think that after the fire, they knocked it all down.
They took that whole lot.
Right.
Okay. Shall we say anything more about this area? Can we move on?
I think that's
That'll do it?
basically it on that.
Okay. Now, we're going to mention the diner that stood at 26 and a half or 28 Cabot Street.
Depending on whose opinion you take, the city's or the city directory listings.
And this diner, according to your notes, came into existence in 1946, and it lasted about to 1951 under various ownerships.
Right. This diner originally came from Salem, where it had been known as the Hawthorne Diner and the Pequot Diner in the Derby Street area around the intersection of
Is it Congress comes
Congress
across?
Street,
From
right.
Pequot Mills.
Exactly. And the man who ran it over there claimed that it had once belonged to Bossy Gillis. I tend to doubt it just because of the time references, but I know Bossy Gillis did own a diner. For anyone that doesn't know who he was the infamous mayor of Newburyport. But
It could be true. I mean, who's to say that it isn't, really?
Well, it's possible, but I doubt it. But the diner found its way over here, basically a victim of a cafeteria being installed in the Pequot Mills during World War II.
Sure.
And they installed it approximately in front of where the upholstery workshop is on Cabot Street.
Okay. We read a few of the names, Richard, that ran this place. If you would.
Yeah, this is another. Not quite as bad as the other one, though. Started out with a 1946 owner, Charles Breton, B-R-E-T-O-N. Then in 1947 to 48, it was Ernest Bertolucci. And then 49 to 51, Arthur F. Rust.
Well, it's pronounced Ruest.
Ruest, okay. We don't want to insult that family. And then again, we go through a long list of people that worked there and the construction of the diner and that sort of thing.
According to the woman who actually owns the property, she claimed that the diner was still on that property. It's now a building that's sort of red. It had been a cottage-style gas station at one time.
And then there was a printer or something in there at one time, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
And according to the city permits, when they put the diner there, that diner could have fit in that cinder block addition to that gas station part.
That's one thing we might mention. These diners being mobile to an extent, many of them were moved
They travel
helter
around.
skelter. They made
Oh.
the round trips, didn't they, Gary?
Sure. Oh, yes. And they were meant to be mobile.
Yeah.
And it sort of had a lot to do with the way that they were built and their size and so forth.
They could easily be trailered down the highway.
Oh, yes.
If business was bad here, you could move it somewhere else
Right.
without too much trouble.
That was always one of the big selling points.
Were there any kind of licenses needed to operate one of these establishments going back to the earlier days, or could you just set up a shop and start serving the food?
I think you needed the same sort of licenses that anyone serving food would have to get.
Yeah.
Fiddler's license.
Yeah.
But I'm sure as the years went by, the restrictions became a little more stringent, though, wouldn't you think, Richard?
Probably like any restaurant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with the food preparation and all.
Yep.
Well, now we're going to come up to 386 Cabot Street, and this is the diner, ladies and gentlemen, that most of us are familiar with. It was eventually to be known as the Miss Beverly Diner.
And this diner is interesting because it's not the first diner on that spot. It had originally been known as Edith's Diner, and there was an older diner that had been in Gloucester first, known as the Hesperus, which is a name I love for that for a diner. And
Let's hope it wasn't a wreck of a
Wreck,
place.
no, actually, I guess it was pretty good. And it was an old car that there wasn't many made of in this area, many situated in this area, known as a Ward and Dickinson car. A very sort of boxy, train-like look to it. But that came here, and that sat on that spot from around 1941 till the installation of the Miss Beverly in 1950.
Right, and this is, for the folks that aren't sure, this is right at Gloucester Crossing, where Buffalo Bill's roast beef is today.
Right. And who knows, maybe the original porcelain panels and all are still underneath that brick. It'd be fun to rip it off and,
Oh, wouldn't it though?
and see.
Yeah. Richard, again, would you just read the names quickly of the people who ran the place from 1941?
Yeah, well, starting in 1941, we had Herbert and Edith Johnson. And then in 1943, Tony Udenoff, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. 1944 through 49, it was known as Al and Ernie's Diner, and it was owned by Hugo H. Hedblom and Ernest Williams. Then in 1950, as Al's Diner, it was still Hugo Hedblom by himself. Then 1950 through 64, as the Miss Beverly Diner, Hugo Hedblom still, and 1965 through 74, it was Alfred J. Latarella, and 1974, John Lanzakis, and that's the Buffalo Bill's roast beef period of time.
Now, the original diner sits under the facade of the Buffalo Bill structure today, correct?
I believe so. I wouldn't have, I don't see any reason why they would have torn that off.
Yeah, I don't think they did. I think it's just covered over with that very popular foamy mansard roof that they were doing in the 70s.
Yeah.
And you know, just a New England brickmaster.
I know the last time I was in there, which was a number of years ago, the refrigeration units were still there that were a part of the Miss Beverly Diner.
Yeah, it's pretty original inside. The menu boards are still there. I believe the original